Are we good? Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Daniel Roth. I am the director of the Pardes Center for Judaism and Conflict Resolution. And welcome to the webinar for rabbis on Mahloket Matters, How to Disagree Constructively. And this is unit 1 of what we're hoping to be an upcoming series that is going to be about text and practice. And this we're calling the first one, the Sanhedrin way. And the goal of this webinar is to be another tool in addition to the Rabbi's Guide and the short video that we put out, to be another tool that rabbis can feel like they really are immersed in both the text and the theory as well as the practice. And that's why I want to really encourage the people feel comfortable to unmute yourself or to write a comment in the chat box. I'm going to ask for some interaction and some questions here and there, but I want you to feel that you can ask so that we can relate to your questions and you can feel as comfortable as possible with the material that we have prepared. Okay, so I'm just going to move down. Okay, so I am looking right now. I'm going to be using as the base of our conversation a combination of the Rabbi's Guide, as well as the source sheet that we prepared that you could use with your congregation. And I'm going to spend most of the time of the webinar focusing on familiarizing yourselves with the text and the theory. And then at the end, I'm going to run through how the exercise works. And again, just continue to ask if you have questions or take comments. So the goal of not just of this webinar, the goal of the session that we prepared, that we're encouraging communities around primarily North America to bring to their communities is twofold. One is to learn text and theory about how to disagree constructively by studying the procedures of the ancient Sanhedrin. And the second is not just to study text and theory, but to experience it, to practice engaging in constructive disagreement using what we're calling a mock Sanhedrin exercise. And just to say a word about where this came from, you know, we're familiar with how rabbinic text has multiple interpretations and that we like to learn rabbinic text in Chavruta, in study partners. But so much of that culture that we're familiar with that makes up the pluralistic and diverse aspects of Judaism, I believe, comes or originates from the ancient Sanhedrin, this ancient Jewish, you know, the first Beit Midrash, if you will, this ancient Jewish parliament, also court, where you had the wise, most knowledgeable people coming together and making major decisions, not just on legal issues, but on major decisions regarding the future of the Jewish people. And what's very striking to me and to scholars that have researched it is that these rabbis that are sitting together making life and death decisions ran the risk of being in groupthink because they all are coming from pretty much elitist backgrounds, more or less the same yeshivot, the same academies. And when everybody is growing up with the same type of education, and everybody's a more or less the same socioeconomic level, there's such a challenge of everybody thinking in the same direction that they therefore had to make all the more so certain regulations that they would not be stuck all being of the same opinion. And they created, sorry about that, they created several different guidelines that were put forth in order to encourage that they were not trapped in just their own interpretation of truth. There are numerous regulations that they used to have. I wanted to focus on 4 because I found these 4 to be most relevant to how we could bring this culture to our own communities and congregations. I will point out a wonderful academic article that if you've seen the source sheet, you'll already have seen it, that was done about groupthink and the ancient Sanhedrin. I'll point that out in a little bit. If you want to learn more, I encourage you to download that article. So let's start with the first guideline. The first guideline, a Mishnah, 3rd century, describes how the Sanhedrin would sit. The Sanhedrin was organized like half a round granary so that each judge could see each judge. And there you have the picture where, according to most traditions, the Nasi and Av Beit Din, meaning the prince or the president, the head of the Sanhedrin, the head of the court, are sitting right there in the middle, okay? And everybody else is in a half circle, with the disputants, when there was a case of dispute, are sitting facing them. And then where we're standing, looking at that picture, if you will, we're rows of students. And the students also played a role that occasionally, if there was a question or if they noticed that there was something, if a student noticed that their rabbis were heading in the wrong direction, they too had the responsibility to stand up and say, "You're wrong." So why is this so significant that they're sitting in this half circle? What can we learn from this? And here you can take a moment, you can unmute your, wait, can they unmute themselves? We're going to unmute you, but I need you to mute or unmute yourselves, okay?
That's exactly what's
responsibility. There we go. Now you're all unmuted.
I mean, I'm not sure she had a, they might have unmuted me.
We have unmuted you.
They
it's
just,
a very big responsibility.
they just made an announcement they unmuted. I put myself on mute.
Yes. So what do you think about this? Why is this potentially a guideline for?
Yeah. Should I send you an invitation? It's a bye bye Mahloket.
So they can see one another, which is different than modern courts.
Is it different than modern courts?
Sure, because they sit in a line now.
They often will sit in a line, correct? I think in the Israeli High Court, they sit in sort of a half a circle. That's true. So why is it so significant that they're able to see each other?
You can't hide your emotion.
So they're able to see the other one, what they're feeling.
It's also harder to lie if you are looking someone straight in the eyes.
And less anonymous.
So I'm able to see, not just hear, I'm able to see the body language to get a sense of if this is being honest, what you're experiencing, what you're feeling. Ironically, as we're talking about this, we can sort of see each other, not entirely. It seems so straightforward wisdom, but there's something so true about just how we're sitting. This is a picture here on the bottom left of the Jirga process, which is a well-known conflict resolution peace circle of indigenous practice of the Pushtan region between Afghanistan and Pakistan, where you see they're literally sitting the way the Sanhedrin would sit. You have everybody in that half circle with the disputants in the middle, and they bring the disputants into the conversation. There's a whole way of arguing back and forth until they come to what is correct. On the right, okay, not our court system, but in theory, right, the political system is supposed to be in a half circle so people can hear and people can see one another. I just want to point out, as we're doing this, I want to be learning the text and teaching and just pointing out different ways that I can imagine using this and teaching this. So one way is to use a source sheet that we prepared, and you could spend a lot more time, you could spend less time with it. But also, if you want to use the video as part of the activity, the sources, the 4 core sources are actually in the video. And I could imagine people pausing it if you wanted, taking some ideas like I was just doing with you right now, and then unpausing, hearing what were some of the thoughts mentioned in the video, and then continuing. Or people could just use that video as a prep before the session. I brought here a couple of commentaries on each of these sources that really speak to why they saw it as a guideline. Some of them are traditional. Some of them are from this article by Professor Eliezer Schnell, who's a social psychologist who wrote about the wisdom from the Sanhedrin regarding how to avoid groupthink. So first is a 16th century commentary on the Talmud, Rabbi Yaakov ibn Habib, one of the most famous people to be exiled from the Spanish Inquisition. He writes, like a granary, they would sit in affection and friendship, and as one community. It builds a bond, right, when we're all together. As a Sanhedrin within which no one was suspicious of the other, which speaks very much to what you were saying. You can see the honesty and the emotions of the other, that they should see one another. This is so that they each should be able to hear the words of the other, and so that they can argue with one another until the proper ruling should come out. And Schnell, without reading the whole quote inside, he writes on the bottom there, the semicircle configuration in which the judges sat may have emphasized that despite differences in seniority, I mean, there were clearly hierarchies and eminence, no individual's opinion was more important than the others. It's flat. What I tried to do with this source sheet, by the way, is I didn't want to only bring sources that agree that it's important to disagree. I wanted to bring at least one source that disagrees and that feels it's important that we don't disagree. If that made any sense, okay, I brought an example, the Jerusalem Talmud. Jerusalem Talmud tells over almost word for word what the earlier Mishnah said. Now we're 5th century, but notice a slight difference that changes the whole story. The Jerusalem Talmud writes, the Sanhedrin was organized like half a round granary, and the Nasi, right, the prince or the head of the Sanhedrin, would sit in the middle in order that all will be able to see him and hear his voice. It's almost the same, but it's the exact opposite. Because the question is, where is truth? Is truth with the Nasi, the rabbi, the lecturer, the professor, or is truth in the middle? When I read these sources, I think about the two places that I teach. I teach at Pardes. Pardes, every classroom is in half a circle, right? In the form of a chet, because the very essence is that the truth is not with the teacher. The truth is with the text. The truth is in the conversation. Everyone is supposed to see each other, learn from each other. I also teach it at Bar Ilan University and at Tel Aviv University, and the chairs are literally nailed to the floor in straight rows, because God forbid anyone should ever have two students turn to each other and learn from one another, argue, discuss, because the truth is where the stage is in the front, and everybody else is just supposed to be passively taking notes. So here, I feel like this Jerusalem Talmud is actually sort of disagreeing or pushing for a different rationale for why they're sitting in that half circle. And historians have pointed out, or historical legends, that later on in Babylonian yeshivot, in the Gaonic time period, early medieval, that the yeshivot actually were straight lines, and that the head of the yeshiva did have the truth, and there wasn't that same kind of everyone seeing each other and arguing with each other. Here you have an example of the classic old schoolroom that sends that message, as opposed to the screenshot on the bottom right, which was our opening circle of how we did the text study when we wanted to model this in the video, starting with the half a circle and then transitioning into the mock Sanhedrin. So the first guideline, make sure to sit in a manner that everyone can hear and see and learn from one another, okay? This is a pretty straightforward, simple one. And I'm going to move forward so we get to the more complicated ones, okay? And you'll let me know if there's any chats that people would like to add. So the second guideline, and this is not, again, there are numerous, but these are the ones that I I felt were really pertinent for creating the culture that we're trying to do, states that, again in the Mishnah, that capital cases began from the judges on the side. Okay, here's a picture of them starting from the side. Why was that significant? Why might that be a guideline? What do you think? You can chat or unmute yourself. Can they unmute themselves?
If you cannot unmute yourself, send me a chat and I will unmute you. I'm considered Pardes Institute.
Yeah. Any thoughts? Why start on the judges on the side?
To allow everyone to have a valid opinion, or to express an equal opinion.
Because the assumption is who's sitting on the side? Pardon?
The less seniority or younger people?
Yeah, apparently they were like really, ranked in terms of where your seat is heading into from both sides until they get to the Nasi or the Av Beit Din that are sitting there in the middle, that are the most distinguished, perhaps even the former teachers of some of the others sitting further away from them, closer to where the students are sitting. And, and why might that be an important principle for encouraging disagreement? Because there's such a danger that if the Nasi were to speak first, says, I think the guy's guilty, or I think we should rule on this important critical case in one way, as we know, the chances of somebody standing up and disagreeing are so significantly reduced. And that's the direction that the Tosefta, also Tannaitic source, expanding upon the Mishnah slightly, states that monetary cases began from the greatest judge, capital cases began from the judges on the side, in order that one should not base his opinion upon his teacher or master, upon their Rav, Rabbo. It should be noted, that not all cases have to start from the side. Monetary cases and perhaps other less, critical cases would start with the greatest judge, which is an interesting question of, is there a time that maybe going through this long, exhaustive process of everybody arguing it out is just inappropriate? Let's just ask the specialist, tell us what you think, and let's move on with it. And the worst thing that happens in that case is that somebody has to pay back the $100 that they ruled incorrectly. You take somebody out to the gallows, you can't really call that one back after it's done. So that we should take the time slowly, let's make a process, let's argue. Monetary cases, we can't, slow down the whole system. We have to keep things moving. So it's a question that I wrote in the teacher's guide, also the rabbi's guide, to think about asking, at what point should this go through a longer process? What cases maybe are inappropriate? I note also there that in later rabbinic Jewish law, in later halacha, there is an encouragement that even monetary cases start from the side. So it's not like you are not supposed to do it from the side. It's just that you don't have to. But when it's critical issues, there's an obligation to always start from the side. And Maimonides expands upon this a little bit. He writes, according to the oral tradition, we learned that with regard to cases involving capital punishment, we do not ask the judge of the highest stature to render judgment first, lest the remainder rely on his opinion and not see themselves as worthy to argue against him. Instead, every judge must state what appears to him or her according to their own opinion. Commentaries on the Rambam argue about whose responsibility is this. Some say it is the responsibility of the younger to not be silent. If you know something, speak up and don't be intimidated by your elder. Other opinions actually read it as a prohibition against the senior to not intimidate the others. That you have to create a culture when it's a very, very significant decision of life and death, that you're going to really try to hear all the voices and not, and not be silencing them. So I think that we can fairly say that there's a mutual responsibility creating that culture. Again, Schnell writes in his article, at the bottom there, where he writes, in some, not only were the members not persuaded to vote in accord with the leaders or senior members' positions, they were actively encouraged in their independence. This picture here from the video, in case if you have not seen it, we had Pardes board members with Pardes students learning and working together. And I took the eldest of our board member working with the youngest of our student body. And it was just a cute dynamic to see, not having him intimidate, and for her to be able to speak her mind as well. I see that there's a chat. Let me just see what the question is. This also is a way of grooming the future leaders. Very democratic, but lengthy. It takes a real commitment to process. Two great points that are said here by Alana. Thank you. Both in terms of education that I want to touch upon, like how do we create a culture like this of future leaders? But at the same time, is there a time and a place that it becomes so bureaucratic to go through this that maybe it's just going to, self-destruct as a system? Of every single decision we have to argue it out. Now we know where our culture of our boards and our many Jewish jokes about Jews liking to argue, it comes from a good intention, okay? Doesn't always end there, but it comes with good intentions. So the second guideline, as I see it, and you can tweak it however you like, is that the order of speaking should be designed to ensure that all voices are heard and prevent anyone from being intimidated about expressing their honest opinion. The next two are less, I think, are more surprising, more challenging. I try to do that, going from one to the other. We're no longer in the Mishnah, now we're in the Talmud. And according to Rav Kahana, he writes that if the Sanhedrin unanimously finds the accused guilty, the person is acquitted. The Hebrew is potrim oto. Okay, they patur, person is acquitted. What is going on with that? What do you think?
Not enough dissent was recognized. Not enough, the fear of railroading or groupthink, particularly in such a serious case, is problematic.
Right, and again, the assumption is here, they didn't have lawyers that are sitting and arguing it back and forth. They bring the dispute in front of them, and everybody raises their hand right away and says he's guilty. And Rav Kahana is saying, if you're in a room and no one can argue the other side on a critical life and death issue, and everyone holds the same opinion, be careful. Because you might be stuck in this groupthink concept. And Maimonides articulates that as his understanding of the Talmud when he says, when all the judges of the Sanhedrin began their judgment of a case involving capital punishment and say that the defendant is liable, he is exonerated. There must be some who seek to exonerate him and argue on his behalf, yet the majority hold him liable, only then is he executed. Here, of course, I bring this picture, which I believe everyone here will be familiar with, the famous 12 Angry Men. But it's good to always ask, of other examples where this might be true or not true. Okay.
What happens if he is guilty, though?
They will still. What if he's guilty, and everyone holds that he's guilty, and then they let him go? That's what you're saying?
Yeah, what if he's guilty? Everybody knows it. It was corroborated by witnesses, or is it saying that there was no trial and he just walked in and everyone raised their hands that he's guilty because we all just know it?
It means that the process was something was faulty with the process. Nobody. I mean, we could look at it as Maimonides just saying, oh, it's just putting on brakes. It's a procedural break of saying, can somebody stand up and argue the other side here? That doesn't mean that they're not going to still find him guilty. It just means that he needs to have some type of defense, because we might be trapped into a situation that what might seem obvious is not so obvious. I had a student who worked in the U.S. Army, who served in the U.S. Army, point out to me that there's a procedure amongst the generals, and if everybody's of the same opinion, there has to be a general who stands up and argue. And I said, that's fascinating, because I heard a story that after the 1973 war, where all generals, when they met, said, there is not going to be a surprise attack, there's nothing to worry about. And they were literally traumatized by having been stuck in groupthink. They enacted a new position for one of the generals taking a rotation, what's called the Ipcha Mistabra. They literally took the Talmudic term of, can somebody argue the other rationale? Not because they think it's necessarily the right way, but because, every once in a while we might be all stuck in that thinking. So they had to be careful, like any procedure. If they didn't do the witnesses correctly, the person might be let go. And here too, if nobody stands up and says anything, that's problematic. A really, really obscure rabbinic source that has a beautiful long chapter about the value and virtue of Mahloket, Rav Dov Gottlieb, Poland, 18th century. He writes, he quotes this and he says, for when not even one person arises to oppose the matter with comments and challenging questions and investigation, it is already not possible that the matter will come out and the truth be clarified. For capital punishment is so severe, we are concerned that in such a case, perhaps everyone fell to the same mistaken conception and therefore he's not killed. This story, this picture down here that I just brought up is really my absolute favorite, one of my favorite rabbinic, it's not rabbinic, favorite political legends, okay? We'll call it a political myth. The picture there is Benjamin Disraeli and Otto Bismarck. Okay, they're meeting 1871. And according to the legend, Bismarck turned to Disraeli and said to him, if I had the power, I would silence everybody in parliament to not having more than 1 minute to speak, because they just waste my time. He's referring to the opposition, of course. Because I know exactly what I want to do. I have the power to get it through. And they just literally are bureaucrats wasting my time. And Disraeli turned to him and said, if I didn't have anyone disagreeing with me in my parliament, I would go out and pay them for great sums of money until they took apart all of my points. We argued it out, and then I knew I was in the right direction. And Bismarck, according to legend, says to him, where did you get such a crazy idea? And Disraeli says, ancient family tradition. What's interesting about that legend is that I found it in a book about Yeshivat Volozhin, a book called Makor Baruch, which described the culture of disagreement and the value of never learning text by yourself, but always with a chavruta, lest you be trapped into your own preconceived truth. And they brought this as a legend to encourage their yeshiva students to say, look at the greatest politician of our generation. He knows where his ability to engage in civil discourse came from. It came from the culture, the Jewish culture of Mahloket. And therefore, you guys have to make sure that you're engaging in it in that way. So I love that source just because it connects a lot of what we're trying to do of the culture of how we learn text to the culture of how we're engaging in civil discourse today. And again, here Schnell points that out where he writes in that last sentence, if all 70 members vote unanimously without any discussion at all, then there is reason to fear that groupthink conformity pressures may be to blame. But as I promised, I always want to bring one source that disagrees with the value of disagreeing, okay? The Yad Ramah, in this case. The Yad Ramah 2 generations before Maimonides, Rabbi Meir Abulafia, he read the Talmudic passage of Rav Kahana the opposite way. That the word putrimoto does not mean they exempt him, it means they take him out to kill him right away. And therefore, he understood the Talmud as saying, in this case, when everyone agrees and no dissenting opinions are heard, since not even one of them has seen any merit in his favor, they will not find any more merit, and it is not beneficial to postpone the execution of the law that he is guilty. Because they used to, if there was somebody who disagreed, they would have to sleep on it, wait 24 hours, and then come back and then do the final decision. But here he's saying, if everyone's in agreement, why schlep it on? Why put this guy another night when he's just in agony, he knows he's going to be killed anyway? Let's put him, there's a very strong prohibition about not postponing the sentence so the person's not in more pain, psychological pain. But the Yad Ramah is engaging in a deep philosophical debate with Maimonides here. Where is truth? When everyone is in agreement or when everyone is arguing? My friend and colleague, Professor Mark Gopin, who's a tremendous scholar of religion and conflict resolution, I had him speaking to my students the other day, at my Israeli students, and he told this story when he was working in Syria, that he met with a minister of the Syrian government, and they said, conflict resolution, that's so interesting, we don't have any conflict here. This is 8 years ago. Everyone's in agreement, we all love each other. When there's no conflict, it's a problem. Okay. It is noted by Schnell that in capital cases in U.S. law, there is a need for unanimous opinion. But again, the unanimous opinion should be after they probably already argued. Okay. And I bring you the reference here on the bottom left to the famous quote from Life of Brian of "You are all individuals, or not." Okay. That it's important to not be stuck in that group thing. So the third is make sure.
I just have to add, by the way, that speech was taken that speech about "you're all individuals" was taken word from Margaret Thatcher's campaign speeches.
Really?
Yeah. I was living in England at the time that movie came out, and it was hysterical for that reason. Yeah.
I missed the context. Thank you. Thank you for that, Rashi. The third is make sure you are not surrounded by only those who agree with you. This, I believe, is really one of the most significant challenges of our generation. We know this, whether it be social media, whether it be geographically, how communities of difference are living further apart from each other. And, we're not just talking about an ancient Sanhedrin, we're talking about what's our community, what's our culture. How do we encourage opinions and want to hear different voices instead of, silencing them and thinking that we've agreed and arrived at truth. The fourth is a guideline that for me is the most important, and interestingly enough, Schnell does not relate to it in his article, but I think it's absolutely the most significant one, which is who gets a seat at the Sanhedrin? Who's qualified to sit here? And there are numerous qualifications that the Talmud brings. They have to know a whole bunch of languages. They have to, be extremely knowledgeable. But one of them, according to Rav Yehuda, in the name of Rav, says none is to be given a seat in the Sanhedrin unless he is able to prove the cleanliness or the purity of a reptile from biblical text. Okay, here's our reptile, which in today's language would mean that's kosher. How the heck do you do that? How do you prove the most obvious, clear-cut passage in the Torah that a sheretz is the very definition of something impure? If you can't prove that that thing is pure, you don't belong here. What is that? What kind of regulation is that? What do we learn from that? What do you think about this? Well, you can unmute. Thoughts?
You have to be able to see the story from both sides.
Yeah, you have to be able to to not be trapped into something that is so clear-cut true. You still have to be able to dig deeper and look, at least entertain the possibility of seeing things differently. You know the famous story, if we're talking about Volozhin, the famous story of Reb Chaim of Volozhin, where two women come to him with the same chicken. The famous story where a rich woman comes and she asks, is the chicken, did it have a kosher shchita? Was it slaughtered properly? And he rules that it's not kosher. Then a poor woman comes with the exact same chicken, asks the same exact question, he rules that it's kosher. To me, that's what this is talking about. To be a great leader is not to just look at the text and to have the text tell us what to think, but it's to be interpreters of the text. It's to be able to think and argue and understand different ways and to make the right decision for that particular moment, and not to be stuck in just what seems to be obvious and conventional wisdom. This brings me to really my absolute top #1 favorite legend that has changed my life when I first became aware of it a couple of years ago, which is, how did Rebbe Meir know to argue the purity of a reptile? And according to the Midrash and Psalms, and there are numerous versions of this Midrash, but this is my favorite one. It's a clear one, even though it's a little bit later, it's 9th century. Where Rabbi Abahu said, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Akiva had a student, Rabbi Meir was his name, and he would prove the purity of a reptile from the Bible with 49 reasons and would prove its impurity with 49 reasons. Meaning he was, as it was stated, he could argue both sides. He could argue how it could be pure and how it could be impure using 49 this way and that way. That concept of the 49-49 comes from an earlier tradition brought in the name of Rabbi Yanai, that tells that when Moses went up to Sinai, he asked God for a Torah chatucha, a clear-cut Torah. Please just tell me what you want. I refer to this as art scroll, or something that will just make all the bumps of the text smooth so I'm not so confused. And God said, if I give you a Torah chatucha, a clear-cut Torah, lo hayta l'regel amida, it will become, no foot will be able to stand up. It will become too rigid of a tradition. Therefore, what I'm going to tell you to do is that on every single law, on every single line, you're going to have to know how to argue it 49 ways one way and 49 ways another way. And then don't give up and say, oh, you're both right. But rather, after you've argued 49, then you have to still raise your hand with confidence and vote one way or the other. This idea is obviously similar to many other rabbinic legends, the famous stories of God, stay out of the Beit Midrash, we got this, we're going to argue it out. But what's so incredibly significant about this is that it's a lot of reasons to be able to say, I have 49 rationales for why I'm right, but I don't have the full 50. 50 in rabbinic theology means absolute truth, or absolute anything is the 50. And God, in another legend, says to Moses, I'm not going to give you the 50 gates of wisdom. I'm only going to give you the 49. Meaning, 49 is a lot of reasons why I could be right to say that that reptile is impure, or that decision is the right one. But it also encourages a certain amount of humility and curiosity that there could be a totally other 49 of how people are reading it. And one of the things that that I see to learn from this and want to encourage is, what are my 49 that bring me to my truth and my interpretation of reality?
Yeah. I'm on a conference call.
And what are the 49 that bring the person who has a totally different ideological or political opinion than my own, the life experiences, the books, the education that bring them to what they believe is true? And my definition of a constructive conflict is when we're engaging in a 49-49, meaning I'm going to really advocate for what I believe is true, but I'm going to be curious to hear yours. And my definition of a destructive conflict is when it's a 50-0 game, which is basically two people arguing at each other, speaking totally different languages that they don't understand. They're making a lot of noise, but nobody's actually listening or understanding. 49-49 is when we're really learning in a conversation. And the Midrash ends here with saying that even young children in the mythical time period of King David and King Saul, when the Jewish education was the best ever, it's been downhill since then, right? Each child knew how to argue 49 ways of how to read their text. Meaning, if the Hebrew school knows how to do this, then we can expect when they become board members, they're going to be constructive in how they're going to engage and listen with humility and respect and grow from the discussion instead of get frustrated and burnt out. So all of that is about that last and fourth guideline. I'll take a comment in one moment. I just want to bring the counter argument, which the Talmud says we don't rule the law according to Rabbi Meir, because every single law he used to argue both ways, and therefore we're never quite sure what it is that he believed. Rashi explains they were not able to understand which of his words were correct and which of his words were not correct for the word, for he would give a reasonable and logical argument on what was not the law, just as he did on what was the law. I mean, imagine a politician getting up and giving a passionate speech for why both sides are right. Would we respect that or be totally confused by that? So, I mean, again, like all wisdom, there's a time and a place, right? And I think it's important that we advocate for this, but also realize that there are problematics because there's certain times that we have to make a decision. And if we're wishy-washy, maybe that's a weakness. But if we're always promoting only 50-0, I believe that that's only going to lead to destructive conflict and violence. And I'll just bring in here my own Rav Aaron Lichtenstein of blessed memory, who I learned with for 8 years, who drilled within our mind to never move to the next line in the Talmud until we knew how to argue contradictory truths on every line. But if you ever asked him for a straightforward opinion, you would never get it. He would always say, mitzad echad, mitzad sheni, you could look at it this way, you could look at it that way. And he tried to empower us to think critically and make good decisions. But he was not somebody who's going to stand up and say, this is the only way of how to look at it. It's a strength and a weakness. So there's a chat. Just give me one moment to see what the question was or comment. Okay. Ilana, I feel like it's something else. Can you put yourself in someone else's shoes? Do you have the cognitive flexibility? The rabbi and the kosher chicken is rather showing compassion for a context. That's beautiful, right? Can I really be aware of my 49 and really be able to engage in understanding the contradictory narrative? It takes a tremendous amount of work. And another comment here, this brings to mind the very important therapeutic exercise of having to clearly articulate the other person's viewpoint. Exactly. And I think that, I think this is about empathy. This is about really deep learning. And I also want to emphasize, this is not just postmodernism that everybody's right. This is all, because ultimately these guys would have to vote. And I think it's good advocacy as well. That I'm going to be a better advocate to actually convince you when I'm able to show that I fully understood your 49. So the fourth guideline is make sure each member really knows how to argue both sides on an issue before voting. So this brings us to the end of some of the text study. I want to now take a few minutes and talk about how do we not just nod and say, okay, these are some text, it's some theory. How do we actually practice this as a means to creating this as a culture within our communities? And here, I want to just mention, we're calling it a mock Sanhedrin, that the people in the classroom turn into a Sanhedrin, but it's also known as a constructive controversy exercise. This is not language that I invented. This is language that was first written about extensively by social psychologists back in the 70s. In particular, I really recommend the article by David and Roger Johnson called Civil Political Discourse in a Democracy, the Contribution of Psychology. It has beautiful sources about the founding fathers of America and the relationship to studies of social psychology going through constructive controversy. And they basically make the claim that this process is at the very heart of American democracy. And without it, American democracy will be unhealthy. I'm not going to go too much into the process of what they describe, because I'd rather just walk through the steps and talk about it. But I do recommend the article if you're interested in doing a little bit of extra reading and understanding of their process. So what we've done is we thought of taking a dilemma. you could use this exercise on any kind of dilemma you want. It's used in the business world. It's used in educational forums. It's used in, in all sorts of different trainings. But we thought it'd be interesting to try to challenge communities throughout North America with a dilemma about a controversial speaker. Okay. If you have not seen the dilemma, we put it in the context of the orchard of Pardes. You're welcome to tweak it, however, to make it feel as close or as far, so it's not too close to your community. That's fine, but we wanted to do it, where it really hits the community in a way that different values are going to be at stake. When I did this with my Israeli students, it was about a South African scholar joining BDS, and they had to argue about whether to invite him to the community or not. And just to explain that different communities might feel slightly different dilemmas, but we do want to see this as the core. But I want to focus more on the process, okay? The process of a constructive controversy that we're calling a mock Sanhedrin begins with splitting the groups into group of 4 or 5, okay? And then that group of 4, which we call a Beit Midrash, because the Sanhedrin itself was not, they were not all the same. They were of different political parties. We knew there was Beit Hillel, House of Hillel, there's House of Shammai. For a certain period of time, there were also the Sadducees, who totally rejected rabbinic law, and they were also had a seat. So split them into Batei Midrash, into different groups of 4 or 5. Those groups of 4 or 5 split into 2 groups. Johnson refers to them as advocacy pairs. We're referring to them as chavrutot. And that each chavruta will take either keep or cancel the speaker, take 5 minutes and argue and write down their list of points for why they hold this position. They have to get into character, write down every single rationale they can think of. And then we invite them to sit with the other chavruta in a group of 4, not for too long, 7 minutes, so they can really enroll, argue their points, try to get it across, do whatever they can to persuade the other side that they're right. Here we have the 2 different groups of 4 engaging. I don't tell the community what the process is. I just say, trust me, we're going to go from step to step. People get very passionate into their roles pretty quickly after they've had a chance to prepare it and they really are excited about their points. Then they meet, and then after that time period, I ask them to pause and switch. Do the other 49, meaning they've argued the first 49, do the other opposite position. If you look carefully at this picture, you will see that I did a little optical illusion and I changed which direction they're sitting in, okay? That's just to give you. It's really important not to skip the step, that they should sit again for the same amount of period of time, start from scratch in their mindset, but yet remember what were the strengths and weaknesses of the point that had just been mentioned by the other side when they were representing it. What did they find were the holes? What were some ideas that they could now think of? Then again, bring them back and argue it out. Johnson has proven over and over again, and they're not only them, but other social psychologists have proven, people that skip the steps literally don't come out with the same type of creative results that have been proven to be as effective. There always will be a group that we will just, we can solve this, no problem. And sometimes it can be an interesting control group because compare them to the process that others go through is fascinating. So after they've engaged again, arguing, this time taking the other role, the next step is that they're no longer in role, now they are who they are. And as a group of 4 or 5, of their Beit Midrash, they have to come and argue it out and come up with what their group proposal is. I tell them it has to be an agreement. Of course, there can always be a dissenting opinion. There's always that one person in a group of 4 or 5 that really feels strongly that they disagree. But I like to push them to try to get to that proposal. They have to have a representative stand up, write it on a board or on a flip chart of what their proposal is, how they vote, how they rule. That representative gets up and presents it, okay? So I'll have each group of 4 or 5 stand up and present. After they present it, again, not telling them what the next step is, we then take it to vote. The voting, I have everyone go around the circle, state what their vote is. They are no longer need to be loyal to their political party, to their Beit Midrash. They might have been convinced by their own group. They might have been convinced by somebody else's proposal. What they have to do is vote their conscience, okay? And I ask them always to say what their vote is, in this case, keep or do cancel, half a sentence or a sentence about their rationale, and a sentence about what was the process like for them. Were they surprised at any point about something that came up that they learned from it? And as they vote, I write down what happened. When I did the video as a sample, I thought I would rig it to make sure that there would actually be like a split, that they didn't end up doing the same. Miraculously, I did not, and it actually came out to be 4-4, which was nice. And then I asked that each community, after they've done that, take a picture of what their proposal was. It could be a picture with the community, etc., and post on the Facebook group. There's a voting form that people can submit, and then people can see how other communities went, what they ruled. And this is really important because many of our congregations and communities are of like-minded people. Okay, that's just the reality that we're living in right now. But when you see one totally different synagogue in a different part of a country, perhaps from a different denomination or a different ideological bent, ruling in a different way, and we're there, I wanted to create more curiosity about the 4949s and to create more of a cross-communal kind of beginning of a conversation. So that's about the process. I want to pause. I've done a lot of talking and ask if people have questions, if people have concerns, if there's chats. Are there chats? Mm-hmm. There are chats. Okay, a moment, please. This brings to mind the very important.
You already.
Okay, we know that. Sorry, a practical question. As we consider a venue, do you have groups all work in one large room, social hall, or do you use separate rooms? Okay, so using separate rooms can be problematic. I once did this at a hotel near a beach with Israeli high-tech CEOs, and one group of 4 went to the beach and I couldn't find them. And the whole process was mixed up. So don't let them get lost. What I encourage you to do is to have a space where the Sanhedrin sits. So the whole group of whatever you are sit, and then have other area where you can sit in groups of 4 or 5. I've done this with groups of 40. I will be doing this Pardes with a group of about 100 of all of our board, all of our faculty, all of our staff, all of our students, in which case you can't really have everybody going around and voting in the same way. We might be using some technology a little bit to do it, putting up a Google Doc on a screen, and then you can see proposals kind of quickly. There are ways to work with larger groups, but I do encourage, if you have it, to have different spaces. What is the minimum number of participants you need to make the process? It's 8. If it's only 4, it's not the same. 7 is pushing it. If you want to be the 8th, you can, but it could be tricky. But I think that 8 is 8 to 16 is the sweet spot. Okay, so that you can really do this nicely in an hour and a quarter, hour and a half. More is doable, less is harder. Okay. Other questions? So I'll say another word as a point of conclusion and charge. We're launching this as part of the Pardes initiative that we started a few years ago called the 9 Adar Project. In case if there are people on the call who do not yet know what the story of 9th of Adar is, I want to emphasize that I believe that 5 years ago, 6 years ago, no one had heard really of the 9th of Adar. I had not heard of the 9th of Adar. We heard of the 9th of Av. We've heard of a lot of different Jewish holidays. The 9th of Adar is a fast day. No one has ever fasted on it, including the author of the Shulchan Aruch himself, who said, I'm going to write about this day, but I don't fast on this day. And And I just happened to come across it one Friday night in shul, when I just randomly opened up a Shulchan Aruch because I forgot to bring a book. And he writes that on the 9th of Adar, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai had an argument. They had a Mahloket. And that was very puzzling to me because they always had a Mahloket and we don't fast. Because if every day Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai had a Mahloket, we would never eat. And that's also not really characteristic of us. But as I learned, the 9th of Adar, according to some opinions, not all, was the day that Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai ceased to have their disagreements for the sake of heaven. Most historians from Gretz until today, most historians date it to the year 67, the eve of the Great Revolt, when Beit Hillel was arguing for more openness towards the non-Jewish community, towards the Romans, towards making peace. Beit Shammai was arguing towards revolting, gaining back independence, getting rid of the Roman occupier. And what they were arguing over is, can we speak Latin? Can we drink their wine? Can we eat their cheese? Can we shake their hands? And over the relationship to the other and making peace or war, all of their beautiful skills of engaging in a Sanhedrin in a disagreement for the sake of heaven and democracy were thrown out. And according to traditions, they came in with weapons. And some say even 3,000 students died that day. And that's why it was marked as a fast day. So we at Pardes felt like this is an important story that's a wake-up call to how our Jewish culture and how our democracies can deteriorate into violence when people become so ideologically entrenched that they're willing to even perhaps go to violence because the systems of disagreement have failed them. And we see this not only as a day that we want to mark on the calendar, we mark it as a week because there's a disagreement about which day it happened. Some sources say it was the 3rd, some say it was the 4th, some say it was the 7th. So we said, you're all right. We're going to call it a week. But if you do your event then, I think it has extra significance. If you want to do it at another time, that's fine. We are actually doing this as a campaign of getting as many communities as possible doing this and learning from one another, all the way up to Tisha B'Av, till the 9th of Av, July 21st, as a symbol of, can we learn again from our history? Can we make sure that our communities and our country can internalize these historical wisdoms and historical tragedies to make sure that we create communities of disagreement for the sake of heaven and disagreement for the sake of our democracies. So I want to thank you very much for joining me on this webinar. We are more than happy to be in touch and give you whatever support you would like. And we look forward to hearing how it goes with your communities. And keep us posted about when you're doing it and which cities. I am going to be traveling for a couple of weeks personally, visiting different communities during February. If I happen to be in a city that you're at, it'd be lovely. I'd be happy to come in and visit you. Any other questions before we sign off? Is there a chat?
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Shabbat Shalom.